Our top story this hour, Israel is facing widespread international condemnation for striking a tent camp that was housing displaced Palestinians in Rafah. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, at least 45 people were killed in Sunday's airstrike. That was the deadliest incident in southern Gaza City since Israel began its offensive there earlier this month. The IDF claims 2 Hamas militants were killed in the attack and that many measures were taken beforehand to minimize harm to civilians. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is calling the strike a tragic incident. He made the comment while addressing Parliament yesterday, saying there will be an investigation. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. officials tell Axios the Biden administration is looking into whether the attack violates the president's red line. Earlier this month, Biden threatened to suspend the delivery of some weapons if Israel entered population centers in Rafah.
Obviously, there has been this conflict. I do think it is important for us to note here that, again, we've talked about the United States and the kill ratio of enemy combatants to civilians. And you certainly could look at us and any other major country that's fought wars, and you'd be hard-pressed to say that Israel has a higher rate of civilian casualties to enemy combatants than the United States. And I remember back Peter Baker, drone strikes going after al-Qaeda time and again, whether it was killing most of Zawahiri's family while he escaped, whether it was killing Americans in drone strikes, certainly not justifying what's going on in Rafah. And I understand there is a red line there. I am just making sure we're not hypocritical, suggesting that somehow what Israel is doing in warfare is different than what every other country does in warfare. That said, this obviously has to amp up tensions between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu, does it not?
Yeah, it certainly does, obviously, and it doesn't come at a good time for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's certainly not going to convince the International Court, which is considering whether to issue arrest warrants for war crimes, that Israel is, in fact, exercising restraint in the way that the International Court would like it to do, and that the Biden administration would like it to do. Now, for the Biden administration, for President Biden, the red line that he has laid down has been kind of fuzzy. We haven't really seen exactly what he means by that. What he said in general is that they don't want the Israelis to go into Rafah in a big way that would cause inordinate civilian casualties and that would keep aid from flowing to people who need it. They have said so far, up until now, that the limited strikes in Rafah have not crossed that line, that Israel has, in fact, been more restrained in the way it has approached Rafah than it had originally intended to, originally flagged that it would. And most civilians, in fact, have left Rafah. There had been more than 1 million people taking refuge there. The belief is that the majority of those have, in fact, left at this point. But obviously, this attack on a tent of mostly civilian people, 45 dead, is the kind of thing that President Biden was talking about, the kind of thing he wanted to avoid. And whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu has a second thoughts as a result of this, we don't know. But it's terrible timing in terms of figuring out what the American position is going to be on this sort of limited Rafah incursion that we've seen so far. It's not limited to the people who are in that tent.
Jonathan Lemire, the images coming out of this camp are truly horrifying. Women, children, civilians, refugees, frankly, some of them incinerated in this attack. If this doesn't cross the red line, I guess the question could be asked by some, what does the red line mean? Is there really a red line? And if it, in fact, has been crossed in this case or will be crossed at some point in the future, what does that mean in terms of the United States' willingness to support Israel or to withdraw some of its support? What is that red line at this point?
Yeah, it has been, to Peter's point, pretty vague. And you'll recall when the president issued this warning about a red line a few weeks ago, it was about a full-on military operation in Rafah. That still hasn't happened yet, although obviously the other part of it was trying to limit civilian casualties. And this strike, as you note, was truly horrific. The images flooding social media the last couple of days are truly too much to bear. The White House and the National Security Council, they are meeting this week about what happens next. To this point, Prime Minister Netanyahu has frankly resisted most of President Biden's calls to show restraint. There are some in the White House who would argue the fact that they haven't gone into Rafah yet is proof that the president's warnings have worked, at least somewhat. And they also point to Israel's the fact they've had to go back into the northern part of Gaza shows their strategy simply isn't working. But we do seem to be at a bit of an inflection point, Mike Barnicle, as to what happens now with this relationship between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Prime Minister's made clear, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep going after Hamas. We're not going to stop, even if we have to fight it alone. The president has said, he's not cutting all aid to Israel, but he would stop perhaps offensive weapons. We'll see if he takes another step. What's your read on it?
Well, you would think that that is a preoccupation within the White House right now, today, and every day. And Peter Baker, my question to you is twofold, actually. Do you get the sense from talking to people in the White House, your sources who you speak to regularly, that Bibi Netanyahu, in a very real sense, is running against Joe Biden to try and defeat his presidency? And the other aspect of it is, within the White House, the coordination between the American military in terms of counsel and advice to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Do you get the sense, any sense at all, that from this side of the ocean, in Washington, D.C., looking at Tel Aviv and the government and the way this war is being run, that the IDF is somewhat incompetent in managing this operation?
Well, look, on the first point, I think in their darker moments, certainly you hear White House officials, national security officials wondering whether or not Netanyahu is really dealing on the up and up with President Biden, and whether, in fact, he is trying to sabotage the president's reelection campaign, or whether, in fact, he's trying to preserve his own domestic political viability by using President Biden as a foil, right? In other words, that Netanyahu has a pretty fragile right-wing coalition that's running Israel right now in collaboration with some of his enemies in a war cabinet. But he's playing to the right-wing coalition by, in effect, saying, I'm the one person standing up to Biden. I'm the one person who's resisting his calls for a two-state solution. I'm the one person who is continuing to press our campaign against Hamas, regardless of international pressure led by the president. Remember, the president, of course, said he was holding back that one shipment of bombs, 3,500 bombs, a few weeks back. So there's no question that there are politics involved here. And in their darkest moments, the White House officials are quite upset about it, and quite, in fact, cynical about it. At the same time, the president wants to continue to find ways to work with Israel.
All right.